Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I'm going to be doing a best case scenario 2024 election prediction between Trump and Biden. This is, to be clear, not my actual prediction for what I think the most likely electoral results for 2024 Trump versus Biden would be. I will have a card up above that you can check out to watch my actual prediction for what I believe to be most likely to happen if these two face off again in 2024. So this is simply and only a 2024 prediction based on what the highest total margin that Trump can possibly achieve in an election against Biden in 2024 based on current trends, past electoral results, and the current environment and polling, as well as the economy and people's and voters' overall approval of Biden and their thoughts of Trump as well. This is not necessarily something that will happen. It's very unlikely, but it is best case scenario. This, again, for all those liberals out there who are going to get easily offended by this, oh, no, he won't win this, or that. I'm not saying he's going to, but it's not impossible that he could potentially win them. So, starting out, I'll do all of the safe states. Now, this will look fairly similar, but it will look a little bit different than it normally does because, yes, there's the normal states that are always safe for Republicans, but those states are going to be changing a little bit as a result. So, this is how it would normally stand. These are normally the safe states Republicans hold in a normal electoral year. This is more than likely what they will hold as safe states in 2024. But that's going to change a little bit with this best case scenario for Trump prediction. Now, these margins are already quite safe Republican, but in this case, these would be even further into the red column for Trump than a normal election year. So I think in this cycle, a Texas safe is something that would happen. I think the state will shift back. We can see this if we look at shifts from 2016 anyway. This is even just something that I think could potentially happen in 2024, regardless of best case scenario. With the trends of these Latino voters in the South all shifting to the right, that is massive. And I do think those trends will continue. That will have a very, very big impact on the Republican success in Texas in the future and how Texas votes. Yes, these suburbs have shifted a bit to the left in 2020 from 2016, but they're pretty close to maxed out for Democrats already as it is. It's not very, very easy in a lot of these counties for Democrats to get any closer, and a lot of them will reverse. So, if we take that into account, Texas will likely be a safe state in this scenario, especially in the best case scenario circumstance. Now, Florida, I'm going to give that as safe in this scenario. We already know DeSantis has been a great governor. Trump endorsed. He's turned the state from a swing state into a very, very conservative state, and it's fast trending to the right with DeSantis polling 8 to 10 plus points ahead of Charlie Crist for the governorship, which is a huge margin. The state went for Trump by around 3-something points in 2020, one of the largest margins in a long time. And we see this. The trends in the state, for the most part, are almost all to the right, especially Miami-Dade County, a very large county that is quite close, a county that Republicans could potentially win in 2024, especially in a best case scenario, but even outside of that, this is a margin they could make up. You can see it even shifted 22 points from 2016 alone, and this is because these are Cuban voters. These are very conservative, anti-socialist voters who vote very, very strongly against current Democrat policy. They don't like the Democrat Party as it stands right now, so they voted against them. So as a result, I think Florida would even be safe. Now, in my actual predictions, I usually put it as a likely state by 2024. And some people might say, oh, it was only 3%. But in a best case scenario, you have to consider it's very likely a Trump election 2024 candidacy would win the state by a safe margin. And I think the same thing would happen in North Carolina. That one might be a little more controversial in this case, but the state was very strongly and ancestrally Republican for a decent amount of time. It was quite close in 2020, as we can see here. If we look at the state, it was very close. It was down to the wire. Now, barring some other things that may have happened here and there, the state is probably actually further right than this. 2020 was an interesting national environment. Overall, the state isn't really trending any direction. I've said it before, the state's quite stagnant, but it is still a fairly conservative state, and I do think in this cycle it will shift back into a lean to likely Republican margin, and in a best case scenario year, I see North Carolina going safe for Trump. And, oh, obviously, Maine's district will likely be safe. Now, these are all of the safe states Republicans can hope to achieve, I think, realistically in 2024, best case scenario even. It's not a huge amount of changes, these three being the only real changes to the safe state list, but that's still fairly big, and we still have to consider the upcoming states. Now, safe for Democrats, I'd give California, Washington, Illinois, New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maryland, DC, and Delaware. Actually, no. If we look at Delaware, I could actually say that might even be closer to a likely margin, and potentially same for Connecticut. Yeah, maybe not. No, Connecticut would still be safe in this scenario, but just barely, and I do think Delaware and New Jersey wouldn't actually be safe in this case. New Jersey is actually a lot closer than most of these other states up here in the New England, the eastern part of the country. It is surprisingly a little more Republican than most of this area is. Now, and I'll explain Oregon a little bit more in a minute as well. Hawaii will obviously be safe as well. So, Oregon, most people would probably put that safe, but in a best case scenario, I can't say I see that happening. You look at Oregon, it was only 16 points. That is a margin that in a strong Republican showing, very strong, best case scenario, could be closed. The gap could be closed. I'm not saying it's winnable, and I don't think it is, but it is a closable gap. And I might even go as far as say Washington is a likely as well. I think these states would all be likely for Democrats. Realistically, maybe not going to happen, but I think that's what would happen in a good environment for Republicans. I think they could get fairly close in these states. Like, well, close being relative, close compared to what they'd normally get. But nonetheless, they still get closer than they normally would because of the environment. And I should point this out. In this scenario, Trump easily wins the national popular vote by a fairly wide margin, okay? Especially if he's getting these state margins and he's getting like the margins across the country already as it is, he probably wins the popular vote if he doesn't win the rest of these states. But nonetheless, I think Nebraska's district will also be it would be a likely Republican margin. It would shift back probably by a pretty decent margin. I don't see it. It wouldn't go Biden. It's not likely. It's voted Republican for quite a while. 2020 was a bit of an off year. It switched back. I believe there was some redistricting that led to it trending and shifting a bit. But overall, it's likely that it would go Republican again by a fairly wide margin in a good year for Trump. Again, this is all assuming Biden's overall approval and popularity continues to be in the crapper and his economy continues to be a complete dumpster fire. Anyways, moving on, I'm going to move to the likely states for Republicans. I think in this scenario, Wisconsin, a state that's generally trending to the right, Biden only won it by a very, very slight 20,000 vote margin, and it's even questionable as it is. I think the state, especially if you see current polling and trends, it is shifting to the right. Tim Michels will likely win there, as well as Ron Johnson, who's obviously going to win. The state will, I think, in best case scenario, be likely for Republicans. I'd say the same thing for Pennsylvania even. Might be a bit of a stretch, but I think they would, along with Arizona and Nevada, a state that is also fast trending to the right. Again, this looks controversial. The liberals are going to be offended. Good. If you're not willing to think for yourself and really recognize what this video is, that's on you. So, moving on to another state I think Republicans would win. Actually, Georgia as well. I'd put that as likely in this scenario as well. Now, this is all of the likely states that I see even possibly happening. So moving on, we'll go to the lean states, and I think in a lean margin, New Hampshire goes for Trump. The state was quite close in 2020. It was only 7-ish points or something like that. Not even, I think 6 something. It's a state that is even achievable and potentially winnable for Trump in even a normal year by a tilt margin. So a lean margin is not something unreasonable to assume in a really good year for Trump. I also give in a lean margin, I'd say Michigan, and I'd even go as far as say Minnesota. That one might be one of the most controversial, but it's only a 7-point gap. It is easily something that could be made up in a really good year for Trump. So, a little controversial, but I do think it could and likely would happen in this case. Now, New Mexico is actually a closer to be Republican state than Colorado, at least in the last cycle. It was a little bit closer. Biden won Colorado by 55, got 55% of the vote. He only got 54 in New Mexico. Trump got 43.5 in New Mexico. Trump only got 42 in Colorado. And with Ron Chetty being a potential winner of the governorship in New Mexico, that has a very big impact on how the state's future could look. And it may have an impact on who would likely win, especially in best case scenario with Biden's unpopular energy policy in New Mexico. I do think he wins it by a tilt margin. And this one might even be very controversial, but I think he also wins Colorado in a tilt margin. The state, not very close, but I think in this case it would trend enough. It is a very white state, so white people do tend to vote more Republican, more conservative. Yeah, I know they're more hippie, liberal type guys. They're the young millennials. They like the weed. They like that kind of stuff. They're not overly likely to vote for Republican, but it is a more favorable demographic than it is in a state like Oregon or Mexico even, or even some of the southern states in some cases, or California. It is just generally demographically a more favorable state if we take out the factor that a lot of these white voters are very liberal. Now, I think the last two here, Virginia and Maine at large, I think Republicans win Maine at large in a lean margin. I actually meant to put that before. I think they win in a lean margin. I think they win those 2 electoral votes. And then moving on to the final one, Virginia. That one, it was a plus 10 Democrat state in 2020. Overall, I think the state is, if we look closely, we can see it did trend a lot up here, but it's kind of maxed out in some cases. And with Youngkin's win in the state, the Nova area is pretty full as it is, and it could potentially trend a little bit more to the right. And assuming Youngkin does a good job, I do think that has some impact, and I think the state itself could potentially in the future start trending back to the right. But in this scenario, I think in a tilt margin, Virginia would go for Trump. So that's the final electoral count. Trump 357 to Biden's 181. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing and leaving a like, and turn on the bell notification as well if you want to be kept up to date. If you want to see more content like this as well, leave a comment, let me know what you think. Anyways, that's all for now. Hope you guys have a good night.